Southern Pacific number 4449 is a GS4. The GS in that stands for Golden State or General Service, and she was actually the last steam engine manufactured in the first order of that type that Southern Pacific had placed. She's at 484 Northern, a fairly large locomotive, and she entered service on May 30th, 1941, spending the first part of her career assigned to the Coast Daylight, which was originally known as the Daylight Limited. It was a premier passenger train on Southern Pacific's lines between LA and San Francisco, California. It was advertised as the most beautiful passenger train in the world, and the GS4s were very good locomotives, and 4449 was no exception. She pulled the train flawlessly, and that wasn't the only one she was assigned to. After the arrival of newer GS4s, as well as the GS5s, 4449 was then assigned to the Golden State route, as well as the Sunset route passenger trains. And then in the early 1950s, she was reassigned again to the Coast Division. Southern Pacific kept their steam engines around a bit longer than most, though they were starting to dieselize. However, 4449 still put in solid work throughout the 1950s. She actually pulled a special 10-car train with her sister, Southern Pacific 4447, for the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society from Los Angeles to Oweno, California, and back again. And by late 1955, she was actually still one of the few daylight steam engines that was still in daylight colors. It was harder to maintain the look of that bright orange, so many of her siblings had been painted black or gray. But by the end of that year, she too fell in line with this practice to minimize costs, and her side skirting was removed. This is because she wouldn't be pulling passenger trains that often anymore. Dieselization of the Coast Daylight in January of that year saw to that, so she didn't really need the streamlining at all. She still occasionally pulled passenger trains, like the San Joaquin Daylight between Oakland and Bakersfield, but mostly she was doing fast freight and helper service. She was semi-retired on September 24th, 1956, but she was still kept around as an emergency backup locomotive, only being officially pulled from service on October 2nd, 1957. But she wasn't immediately sent to the scrapyard. She was put in storage with several of her sisters at Southern Pacific's Bakersfield Roundhouse. She stayed there until 1958. By that point, she'd lost the vast majority of her siblings, all having been scrapped. But 4449 was lucky. She was donated on April 24th, 1958, to the city of Portland, Oregon, for outdoor public display near Oaks Park. But she wasn't chosen for any specific reason beyond convenience. See, she was the first in the deadline of steam locomotives destined for the scrapyard. She was the easiest to move, so purely based on that, she was pulled from the line and sent to Portland. She would be the only GS4 to survive into preservation. She does have a cousin, a GS6, 4460, but outside of these two, no other GS steam locomotives were preserved. But 4449's struggles weren't done. See, because she was being put on outdoor display, she was, well, put in a really bad situation as preservation goes. See, park engines happen a lot because people like seeing them, and if there's no coverage, like some kind of shed, the locomotive is exposed to the elements. This, combined with people being terrible and vandalizing her, stealing external parts consistently, including her builder's plate and her whistle, meant that by 1970, she was in really rough condition. But not as rough as you might expect, and that was due to the actions of one man. His name was Jack Holst, and he was a Southern Pacific employee, as well as a member of the Pacific Northwest chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Mr. Holst had taken it upon himself to look after 4449, along with two other steam locomotives, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700, as well as Oregon Railroad and Navigation 197. He kept their bearings and rods oiled, just in case they were ever allowed to move again. But Holst sadly passed away in 1972, 2 years before 4449 was looked at for a possible return to steam. In 1974, she was evaluated for restoration as she was viewed as a candidate to pull the American Freedom Train. Now, the history of the American Freedom Train could probably be its own video, but I'll give you a quick rundown. The first of such train was a national tour that was proposed in April of 1946 by Attorney General Tom C. Clark. He believed that Americans had begun taking the principles of liberty for granted in the post-war years, and he felt this kind of national stunt might remind people of what America should stand for. The second one, which is what we're talking about now, was to happen between 1975 and 1976, which is to commemorate the United States bicentennial. The original one had actually been pulled by an Alco PA, numbered 1776. She was built specifically for the first Freedom Train. But this time they were looking at a steam engine because they thought that a steam locomotive might attract a lot more attention than diesels, which by that point were a dime a dozen. When they looked at 4449's bearings and rods, they found them to be in excellent condition due to the efforts of Jack Holst. So she was selected, because even though she'd been in the weather and had been vandalized, that damage was generally pretty superficial. Her actual core components, the vital, expensive stuff, was alright. So she was removed from the display on December 13th, 1974, and restored at the Burlington Northern Railroad's Hoyt Street Roundhouse in Portland. She returned to operation just a few months later, April 21st, 1975, and they did repaint her, though not to her original daylight colors. They gave her a special paint scheme of red, white, and blue, since America. Because her original whistle had been stolen, she was given 2 replacement whistles, a Hancock 3-chime from a Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway Challenger on the driver's side, and a second one that was actually a remnant of one of her sisters on the fireman's side, though the latter would eventually be swapped out for a Southern Pacific 6-chime. Now, some sources will actually say that 4449 pulled the train throughout the entire country, and technically speaking, you could say that it was most of the continental United States, but she was only responsible for the western portions of the country. It just happened that encompassed most of the planned routes. The eastern portions were covered by Reading 2101, which had been recently restored by Ross Rowland. And in Texas, yet another locomotive, Texas and Pacific 610, handled pulling the train then. But 4449 still pulled for most of it. In fact, she was at the head of the train for a total of 82 of the 138 stops for the event. And after the event ended, they didn't just throw her back in the park. She then pulled an Amtrak special, the Amtrak Transcontinental Steam Excursion, during 1977. And after 2 years on the road, she then was put back into storage in Portland. But this time, they put her under protective cover. She hung out there for a couple years, and in 1981, she was returned to her original daylight color scheme for Railfair 81 and the opening of the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. She was present along with Union Pacific's 844 and 3985. In 1984, she pulled an all-daylight painted train from Portland via Los Angeles to New Orleans, Louisiana, and back to publicize the World's Fair. It should be stressed that that was a 7,477-mile journey. That's 12,033 kilometers round trip. And that made it the longest steam train excursion in the history of the United States. And there was only one minor incident. On June 11th, she was approaching Del Rio, Texas, still heading towards New Orleans, when the retention plate that holds the drawbar pin in place disconnected and fell between the ties. That allowed the tender, and the entire rest of the train, to uncouple from 4449. While she accelerated, all alone, the crew noticed this pretty much immediately, because, and applied the brakes. She still had enough steam left to back up and reconnect to her tender, and repairs didn't take very long, so she was only slightly behind schedule. Then in 1986, she became a bit of a movie star. She went to Hollywood to appear in a movie called Tough Guys, and pulled some business trains for the Southern Pacific again. In 1989, she met up with Union Pacific 844, again, to make a side-by-side entrance into Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal for the station's 50th anniversary celebrations. Then they ran side-by-side on Santa Fe and Southern Pacific's parallel main lines through Cahoon Pass. though 4449 actually would have to stop as her axle box got a bit overheated. 844 was fine though, she just kept on going. Sometime during the early summer of 1989, she actually had another whistle replacement. The one that she had on the engineer's side was given to Spokane, Portland, and Seattle number 700, and 4449 was given a replacement whistle, a Northern Pacific Hancock 3 chime. She would keep that one for the next 21 years, and later that same year, she would appear in another movie called Come See the Paradise. On April 26, 1991, she returned to Railfare 91 in Sacramento, again with Union Pacific's 844 and 3985, as well as the newly restored Southern Pacific 2472. She also attended the following year's NRHS convention in San Jose, with 2472 again, as well as UP 3985. On that trip, she was given another new whistle on the fireman's side, a Star Brass 5 chime whistle that was taken off of CB&Q M4 class locomotive. She would return to Railfare again in 1999, co-starring with Santa Fe 3751 and Union Pacific's 844 and 3985 again. Those three hang out a lot, I don't know if that was clear, and it was the last time she traversed the route of the Shasta Daylight, whose tracks are now owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. Then, in the year 2000, she was briefly repainted black and silver for a BNSF Employee Appreciation Special. It was traditional for Southern Pacific to paint freight locomotives in black, so because BNSF is a Class 1 freight carrier, they thought it was appropriate for the special to reflect Southern Pacific's old tradition. She also carried BNSF emblems for that train, but they were removed after it was over. Then, in very early 2002, she was repainted in her old American Freedom Train scheme. This was in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Those responsible for 4449's care felt it would be an appropriate tribute during a very dark time in American history. But by fall of 2004, she was returned to her tried-and-true daylight scheme, looking happy as ever. She worked with the Montana Rockies Rail Tours Company, pulling 2 summer excursion trips between Sandpoint, Idaho, and Billings, Montana, including stops at the Livingston Depot. On May 18th and May 19th, 2007, she made another appearance with her old good friend, Union Pacific 844, in the Pacific Northwest for the Puget Sound excursion on BNSF trackage from Tacoma to Everett, Washington, which was a round trip. Then, on March 24th, 2009, it was announced that she would attend Train Festival 2009 in Owasso, Michigan, from July 23rd to the 26th, with an all-day excursion planned for the 23rd and 24th, and a photo run-by planned for each trip. After that, she was simply placed on display for the rest of the event. The move from Portland to Owasso was arranged by her caretakers, Friends of the 4449, as well as Amtrak, the Steam Railroading Institute of Owasso, and the Friends of the 261, referring to Milwaukee Road 261. They actually loaned some of their first-class passenger cars, including the former Milwaukee Road Superdome number 53, and the Cedar Rapids Skytop Lounge for 4449 to pull during the festival. In the following time after the event, she would have to take a 2-year hiatus, as it was time for her mandatory 15-year inspection and overhaul. But that was completed in, like I said, just 2 years, which was pretty fast for a preserved steam locomotive. She was returned to service on November 25th, 2015, and from 2016 to 2019, she pulled several more excursion trains. But it's possible that for the foreseeable future, despite being in good working order, 4449 may not be seen running nearly as often. And that's due to the Oregon Pacific Railroad, which is a short line that was being used for most of these trips. As a Northern, she has a long, rigid wheelbase, and she's pretty heavy. It was determined by the railroad that she was causing excessive wear to their trackage, so she's no longer allowed to pull the annual Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation Holiday Express trains. They substituted her out in 2022 for a smaller locomotive, and it's pretty rare to see her actually fired up as she's not allowed to go very far, though she is housed inside the Oregon Rail Heritage Center, which is a climate-controlled environment. The Friends of Southern Pacific 4449 is a non-profit group that has taken care of her since 1991. She was originally at the Brooklyn Roundhouse in Portland, owned by Union Pacific, but they wanted to demolish that roundhouse to make the yard bigger. So the Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation wound up campaigning a permanent structure to house 4449 and her adoptive siblings, who she was also at the roundhouse with, SP&S 700 and OR&N 197. If you recall, they were the other two that were being taken care of by Jack Holst. I think you'd be happy to know that not only did all three survive, but are now kept in what can be described as the lap of luxury for steam locomotive preservation. There really isn't any more you could ask for when it comes to a facility for keeping these types of locomotives safe. So even though 4449 doesn't run nearly as often as she used to, she is safe, and I imagine will stick around for many years to come. And I always refer to her as the happiest steam locomotive in America just because of her colors. I mean, compared to her stablemates, she's positively joyous with that bright orange, and a lot better off than her cousin, the GS6, number 4460. Her class was never painted in the daylight scheme as they were built during wartime, and they were nicknamed War Babies and Black Daylights. She's often referred to as the Forgotten Daylight because 4449 is so much more famous than her and has had a heck of an excursion career, whereas 4460 just kinda sits around. You know, cousin, I just think if you were a bit happier sometimes, people would be more willing to help you out. I know you want to run again, and I think you deserve to.
Never! These humans, they care nothing for me!
Okay, see, this is what I'm talking about. You just have to calm down. We'll just go out and get you a makeover.
I wear this darkness to show the world my inner pain. Everyone must know that existence is suffering.
I just don't know how to help you. I really want to. We're family.
What is family but a connection of genetics? It means nothing in the grand scheme of things, just like everything else.
Please, cousin, calm down.
We live in a society!
Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, number 700, is the oldest and only surviving example of the Class E1 484 Northern type steam locomotive, and the only surviving original, and by that I mean not purchased, used from another railroad, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway steam locomotive. In other words, she's unique in a lot of ways, and was originally constructed by Baldwin in May of 1938. The E1s were very similar, and by that I mean nearly identical, to the A3 Northerns that were built for Northern Pacific, but the E1s burned oil instead of coal. Spokane, Portland, and Seattle had spent a long time running second-hand equipment, and they were getting frustrated by that. They asked their parent companies, Great Northern and Northern Pacific, to please let them purchase new locomotives. They were permitted to do this, and the new locomotive purchases included 3 of the E1s, 700 and her sisters, 701 and 702. They also got 6 Z6 class Challenger locomotives, 4 664s, for use in freight service. 700 was delivered to the railway on June 21st, 1938, and she, along with her sister 702, would pull overnight passenger trains between Spokane and Vancouver, Washington, along the north shore of the Columbia River. 701 would provide backup and pull freight when needed. However, they couldn't reach Portland until 1944, due to the fact there was an undersized turntable. They're Northerns, they're pretty big, and the turntable just couldn't accommodate them. Her career was not without its incidents, however. In 1938, during her initial trial run, she stopped in front of a rock slide that was blocking the tracks. That wasn't a big deal, but right after the rocks were cleared, a secondary slide occurred and struck her, damaging her trailing truck, but otherwise being a minor inconvenience, and it wasn't like that was her fault at all. However, on March 25th, 1947, while pulling a passenger train in Washington, she had a much worse accident. She suffered a derailment near Snake River after hitting another rock slide. They have those often enough to be obnoxious in Washington, just so we're clear. And she hit this one at 45 miles per hour. This would throw her off the rails, and she would slide down the bank, toppling onto her left side. Incredibly, her engineer, fireman, and leading brakeman all escaped with only minor injuries. She herself was also recovered and sent to the shops for repairs, and continued her career. That same year, the Great Northern Railway had actually begun to streamline their premier passenger train, the Empire Builder, and had started adding diesels to their roster. Spokane, Portland, and Seattle would also begin purchasing diesels at about that time, but they received the new locomotives after they received the streamlined cars. So, the 700 sisters would pull those streamlined coaches for some time, and into the early 50s they started pulling secondary passenger trains. But by 1954, the diesels had completely replaced them for passenger service. So the E1 settled into pulling freight trains until 1955. Just the following year, on May 20th, 1956, a dolled-up number 700, with her smokebox painted a brilliant silver, pulled her last passenger train. The Farewell to Steam run had a total of 21 cars, carrying 1,400 passengers, from Portland, Oregon, to Wishram, Washington, and back again. After this, she, her sisters, and her cousins were all sent to the scrap line. This, of course, could have spelled the end for her, but fate would intervene. Not because of anything Spokane, Portland, and Seattle were planning to do initially. They really were intending to scrap all their steam locomotives. But while this was going on, Union Pacific, which has a history of being much better about donating their steam locomotives, was offering to donate a steam locomotive to the city of Portland, Oregon. SP&S did not want to be outdone by one of their competitors, so they in turn offered to send 700, as she was the one that was the most dolled up compared to her sisters. And Portland did accept. 700 was sent to them on January 14th, 1958. And she would be placed in Oaks Pioneer Park, near Oaks Park, along the Willamette River, along with another locomotive, Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company number 197, and the pair would be later joined by Southern Pacific 4449. Oh yes, these are the three stepsisters of Oaks Park. If you've seen my video on 4449, you know we've been here before. By 1960, 700 had lost both of her sisters, and she was one of only two Spokane, Portland, and Seattle steam locomotives to survive. The other one was a 282, number 539, but she was originally built for Northern Pacific, numbered 1762, so as I said, number 700 is the only original Spokane, Portland, and Seattle steam locomotive left. Park engines can be a very good idea and a very bad idea. On paper, they do allow these old locomotives to survive a lot longer than if they were just sent for scrap, but being in a park, especially not under any kind of shelter, does expose them to the elements, and time takes a toll. Rust, decay, and even vandalism plagued all three locomotives. They were only protected by a chain link fence. They probably would have fallen apart into a state of complete disrepair if not for the efforts of a single Southern Pacific Railroad employee, who also happened to be a member of the Pacific Northwest chapter of the National Railway Historical Society, Jack Holst. We mentioned him when we talked about 4449. Mr. Holst would regularly visit all three locomotives and kept their bearings and rods well greased and oiled, just in case any of them ever got the chance to move again. Sadly, he would pass away in 1972, before the first stepsister of Oaks Park, 4449, was removed after she was looked at to pull the American Freedom Train. When they discovered how well kept her bearings and rods had been, they realized she'd be a perfect choice, and she was swiftly taken from the site to pull it, leaving 700 and 197. But their story didn't end there. In 1975, a 15-year-old boy named Chris McLarney took it upon himself to start working on 700, cleaning and oiling her components, as Jack Holst once did. He would found the PRPA, or Pacific Railroad Preservation Association, in 1977, in an effort to provide support for the preservation work on the locomotive. And 10 years later, on November 9th, 1987, 700 was finally moved from Oaks Park to Southern Pacific's Brooklyn Roundhouse in southeast Portland for the restoration work to be continued. With the support of many individuals as well as the Burlington Northern Railroad, number 700 was finally put back into operation on May 15th, 1990. Now, running a big Northern like 700 definitely comes with its share of difficulties. She's large and powerful, and therefore there's only a handful of places you can safely run her. Plus, she's expensive, both in terms of the fuel she needs and the insurance involved, but she has still seen a decent amount of excursions over the years since 1990, including a doubleheader with her stepsister, 4449, from Portland to Wishram, Washington, and back during the 2005 National Railway Historical Society National Convention, as well as the 2002 Steam Across Montana, from Sandpoint, Idaho to Billings, Montana, and back again. In the spring of 2001, she would run a special excursion called the Homecoming Excursion that ran over the original Spokane, Portland, and Seattle main line through the Columbia River Gorge and lasted 4 days from Portland all the way to Spokane, Washington. And 700 would solo this train pretty much the entire trip, though at one point she suffered some mechanical issues, and BNSF 6308, an EMD SD40-2, was pulled from the train she was helping with and assisted 700. That excursion actually ended a little early, though, as a result of a derailment between the tool car and the power car. It involved the lead trucks on the power car, but again, that wasn't 700's fault, and she would actually be added to the National Register of Historic Places on January 25th, 2006, as the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway steam locomotive. Up until June of 2012, the 700, alongside both her stepsisters, 4449 and 197, called the Union Pacific Brooklyn Roundhouse their home. The city of Portland themselves were leasing the roundhouse for this purpose, but after Union Pacific announced plans to demolish it to allow for the expansion of their yard, they needed to find a new place to hold these engines. So the Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation, with support from the city of Portland, managed to raise funds for a new restoration and visitor center that was down the street from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, to provide the steam locomotives with a permanent and publicly accessible home before the closure of the roundhouse. Construction of the Oregon Rail Heritage Center began in October 2011, and 700 and her stepsisters, as well as the other rail equipment, was moved to the site of the new engine house and heritage center on June 26, 2012. They'd be moved indoors on July 28th, once the engine house was fully enclosed, and it opened to the public on September 22nd, 2012. This facility is arguably the best place to have a steam locomotive currently in the modern day in America. Fully enclosed, climate-controlled, this is the lap of luxury for a preserved steam locomotive. 700 and her stepsisters do not have to worry about anything happening to them in this place, and the Heritage Foundation takes very good care of them. Maintenance of 700 in particular continues to be carried out by the Pacific Railroad Preservation Association and a team of volunteers. She did have to be taken out of service in 2015, however, for her 1,472-day inspection as mandated by the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA. Since then, dedicated volunteers have been working on her to put her back under steam again. In August 2020, the Emory Trust awarded a grant of $35,000 to help complete her rebuild, and in March of 2023, the Emory Trust again gave a grant of $10,500. At the moment, it's hoped that she'll be back up to steam this year, 2024. Although what isn't clear is where she would run. See, in the past, generally, 700, as well as 4449, would run their yearly short excursions on the Oregon Pacific Railroad, a short line route just nearby. But in 2022, they introduced new restrictions on these big northerns. Basically, they were damaging their lines, which is understandable, and that prevents 700 and her stepsister from running on the railroad through to Oaks Park for the foreseeable future. It's not known where they can even put her, or run her at all, and it kind of makes them a little bit stranded out there. I mean, don't get me wrong, they are perfectly safe. Nothing is going to happen to them in this facility. They are well taken care of, frequently inspected, they are in the best of hands, but in terms of running, it's difficult in the modern day, especially with new rules in place in America to actually find places to accept these locomotives. Normally a short line route would be great, as they tend to be more lenient towards the idea, but Oregon Pacific, lately under the new management, just hasn't been keen, and it's restricted 4449 as well as number 700 from operating. But they're still gonna put her back under steam anyway, and I am certain they will find a place where they can run her. Because she's one of a kind, and she's a fan favorite, even sitting next to her bright and colorful stepsister. She also has multiple nicknames. She's dubbed the Lady, or the First Lady of the Northwest, as well as the Night Princess. I love it! Fantastic! Whoever came up with that name, you are awesome. And in any event, she's not going anywhere. And regardless of how often she's able to run, she will be able to be seen and appreciated for years to come. Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company, number 197, is a 462 Pacific steam locomotive, built by Baldwin in 1905 for, well, the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company. She bears a strong resemblance to Southern Pacific locomotives of the same era, and she was designed to pull passengers on the railway. Initially, she was actually constructed as a Volclane compound, along with her three sisters, 194, 195, and 196. She continued to serve the railway, and then in 1923, she and her sisters were given heavy modifications, redesignated to the P2 class, by the Union Pacific Railroad at their Albina Yard in Portland. Union Pacific at that point now owned OR&C, just so we're clear. These modifications included a new Vanderbilt-type tender. As stated, originally she was actually a compound, a four-cylinder compound to be precise, and she had a Stephenson valve gear, having the high-pressure cylinders located between the frames. Those high-pressure cylinders drove the second driving axle, which was of a crank design. The low-pressure cylinders received exhaust from the high-pressure and were located on the outside, and they would drive the second axle more conventionally. But the 1923 redesign changed her to a simple, single-expansion engine, with just two cylinders, and her valve gear was converted from a Stephenson to Wolshart's. She and her sisters were also renumbered to Union Pacific, 3200 through 3203. 197 was 3203. But the rebuilding was a success. The locomotives performed well and survived until the very end of steam. They continued being used until January of 1958. Union Pacific is known historically for being pretty generous when it comes to donating a lot of their retired steam locomotives. Towards the end of the steam age, they were much better than most in this regard, and they decided to save at least one of the P2s, and that wound up being 197, then still numbered as 3203. Union Pacific donated the locomotive to the city of Portland, and she was placed on display near Oaks Amusement Park, in what was known as Oaks Pioneer Park. Yep, if you watched my recent video on number 700, you know that 197 is the third stepsister of Oaks Park. 197 was joined in the park by Southern Pacific 4449 and Spokane. Apparently it's Spokane. Look, y'all gotta stop yelling at me about that. There is an E at the end of that. Phonetically, it should be Spokane. It is not my fault, but Spokane, Portland and Seattle, number 700. She would sit on outdoor display for many years, dealing with the wear and tear associated with that particular situation. And additionally, over time, she would become, well, rather lonesome. In December of 1974, 4449 was pulled out of the park to be restored to pull the American Freedom Train. Then a little over a decade later, number 700 also left to begin her own restoration. 197 was the last engine left in the park, and she was there until the mid-90s. In fact, she can be briefly seen in the movie Free Willy while she was still on display in the park. No, seriously, she's there. I'm not making this up. And then later, due to a parking lot expansion project, she was moved a short distance from her original resting place. Outside of that, though, she was almost forgotten, until late in 1995. When, as is the case with a lot of heritage restoration projects, a small group of individuals decided to band together and save 197. 197. They managed to negotiate with the city of Portland, who eventually agreed to the proposal, but then she required additional mechanical work to get her ready to move at all. She had sat there a lot longer than her stepsisters, so the wear and tear on her was likely a lot worse than them. But by early February of 1996, she was almost ready to move for the first time in nearly 40 years. On February 10th, she was finally removed from the park and sent to the Brooklyn Roundhouse, rejoining her stepsisters, 4449 and 700, also called that place their new home. Interestingly, moving her became a lot more of an alarming project than previously thought, as that day coincided with severe flooding in the Portland area after a series of very bad winter storms. The Willamette River had actually come up so high that it was bordering on the embankment where 197 was sitting. The East Portland Traction Company, now known as the Oregon Pacific Railroad, who owned the nearby right-of-way, actually had to clear several mudslides the previous day in order to get 197 out of there, but she was successfully moved without any major incidents. Getting 197 back up into operation has been a trying experience. It's taken a long time, and it's still ongoing actually. As of 2008, the job was about half complete, and expected to be completed as long as volunteers and funds are made available. The nonprofit all-volunteer group called themselves the Friends of OR&N 197. Until 2012, all 3 stepsisters were stored in the last remaining roundhouse in Portland, but Union Pacific announced plans to close it in order to expand their freight yard, and as a result, the engines needed a new home. The nonprofit Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation was formed to develop plans and build a new facility for the trio. Construction on the Oregon Rail Heritage Center, or ORHC, began in October 2011, and the job was completed just the following year, with all 3 engines being moved into the new facility. As I've mentioned when I've talked about it previously, this location is the lap of luxury when it comes to a preserved steam locomotive. Indoors, climate-controlled, the engines are perfectly safe there, and 197 has sat alongside her 2 stepsisters all this time, but as of the making of this video, she still isn't running yet. While 4449 and 700 have both had their own excursion careers, 197 has taken a lot longer to get up to steam again. And it's likely because she sat around so much longer. The wear and tear on her was much worse. Therefore, the work required to fix her would be a lot more major. As of May of 2023, it was announced the ongoing restoration did receive a major boost. A former Union Pacific executive agreed to help raise the $1 million still needed to get her back under steam. Yeah, see, everyone wants locomotives back under steam. Look, this is a Pacific. She's not the biggest engine in the world. $1 million on top of what's already been done. That's how expensive this can be. But the good news is that over the last few years, a number of significant points of the project have been finished, including rebuilding her air pump and the fabrication of an all-new cab for her. But she still needs work done on both her boiler and the running gear, which probably explains the $1 million price tag. Those 2 things are usually the most expensive bits, so yeah, I believe that. But they're still plugging away at her. And hopefully someday, 197 will be able to run again, alongside both of her stepsisters. Either way though, it is a pretty happy story. By all accounts, they could have been left to waste away. But all 3 wound up being saved, finding a new home, together. And they remain so to this day.